Welcome. Obviously, I'm not Professor Andrew Downs, the coordinator of the American Democracy Project. I have been deputized by him to introduce today's event and speaker. I'm Dr. Ann Livschiz from the History Department. The United States Constitution was signed on September 17, 1787. Each year, we celebrate the anniversary of the signing of the Constitution by offering educational programming about the Constitution. Today, we're going to be hearing from one of IPFW's newest faculty members, Dr. Jeff Melanson. He will be telling us about George Washington's views of the Constitution and President Washington's efforts to implement the Constitution. This talk is being brought to you by the American Democracy Project and the Department of History. We want to thank all of you for coming, and we want to thank CATV for recording the event. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, my colleague and the newest member of the Department of History, Dr. Jeff Melanson. He received his PhD in history from Boston College in 2010. His dissertation, Addressing America, Washington's Farewell and the Making of National Culture, Politics and Diplomacy, 1796 to 1852, won the 2010 prize for the outstanding dissertation in the social sciences. He's the author of a number of articles, including a publication in the Journal of Diplomatic History, a very prestigious journal in the field. At IPFW, he teaches the survey, the first half of the American History Survey, and upper-level courses on early American history, diplomatic history, and American foreign policy. So let's welcome Dr. Jeff Melanson. And of course, afterwards, there's going to be an opportunity for questions. And if you're attending this event for extra credit for your courses, I will send around an attendance sheet if you need to have your attendance confirmed and verified.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone, for being here. During the American Revolution, and especially in the years following its successful conclusion, George Washington became known as the father of his country. He held a special place in the hearts and minds of virtually all Americans. Washington became the focal point of American reverence for the simple reason that when the Continental Congress decided to fight the Revolution, he became the first soldier in the Continental Army. When the Declaration of Independence established the United States, in many ways Washington became the first American that virtually everyone knew. And when citizens of this new country wanted to toast their leaders and celebrate their sacrifice, it was Washington they raised their glasses to. At the end of the war, with independence secured, Washington could have set himself up as a virtual emperor over America and would have encountered very little resistance in doing so. But instead, he willingly gave up his power in deference to the new government forming under the Articles of Confederation. His return to private life, a clear demonstration to the American people that no man was larger than the new nation that had been created. But of course, this behavior only served to reinforce the image of Washington as the ideal American, the true father of his country. It was for this reason that when a small collection of individuals from each of the states gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to write a new constitution, it was deemed essential that Washington be present. And it was for this reason that when that new constitution was finally put forward, Washington's approval of it and the knowledge that he would serve as the first president under it was critical to its ratification by the states. As we are here today to commemorate Constitution Day, tomorrow being the 223rd anniversary of the signing of the Constitution by the delegates at the Constitutional Convention, I want to begin by examining Washington's views on American government in the years before the convention, before moving on to consider his efforts to put the Constitution into best effect during his presidency. Thirteen separate colonies came together as the United States during the Revolutionary War. And as they began laying out their initial plan of government for after they achieved that independence, they were motivated by their negative experiences with Great Britain. The first government under the Articles of Confederation guarded against the types of abuses that the colonies had been exposed to by their former imperial master. The Articles provided for only a small central government composed of a legislature where each of the states had an equal vote, and where that legislature could not compel the states to do anything they didn't want to, such as pay taxes or commit troops for national defense. Most problematically, the only way the Articles of Confederation could be amended was through the unanimous consent of the states. This meant that when it became clear after just a few years that the Articles were inadequate, all of the states, with their various histories, traditions, and priorities, would not only have to agree that change was necessary, but also on the specific form that change would have to take, a nearly impossible agreement to achieve. But in its first days, before all of its shortcomings were made fully apparent, most Americans were all too happy that their national government was small and weak and incapable of violating their rights. George Washington had a very different perspective than most people. As the head of the Continental Army during the Revolution, he had been able to see firsthand the weaknesses of the Confederation government and its inability to provide the Army with enough men, supplies, or monetary support. He had seen firsthand how dangerous such a weak national government could be. After all, if the government couldn't adequately provide for the army that was fighting to secure the independence of the country and its continued existence as a nation, what could be expected of it during times of peace? A year before the end of the war, Washington expressed his fear that, quote, unless Congress speaks in a more decisive tone, unless they are vested with powers by the several states competent to the great purposes of war, our cause is lost. I see one head gradually changing into 13. This quote is revealing of Washington's view of American government, as he was not just upset about the weakness of the government, but also that these newly united states were on the verge of dissolution. What purpose did a government serve if it couldn't act to ensure national survival? If the United States could not survive, there was certainly no way the individual states could prosper as independent countries. As we'll see in a moment, though, the threatened dissolution of the Union was as much the fault of politicians looking out for local interests at the expense of national ones as it was the flaws of the national government itself. And while the United States did win its revolution, it was as much due to the aid of the French and some good luck as it was anything Congress actually did. Now, Washington's fears of the government's weakness proved well-founded, as after the war it quickly became apparent that the government established by the Articles of Confederation was simply incapable of effectively protecting the country's interests. Two areas of special and growing concern in this regard were commerce and foreign relations. After the war, American ports were overrun with British goods that Americans quickly began purchasing in massive quantities, to the benefit of British merchants and manufacturers and the detriment of American ones. But on the other side of the Atlantic, Great Britain had closed its ports to all American goods, doing further damage to American commerce. The logical response by Congress should have been to likewise close American ports to British goods, to put economic pressure on Great Britain to reopen theirs. But under the Articles of Confederation, Congress did not have the authority to regulate commerce, leaving it powerless to correct this imbalance or to aid Americans dependent upon international trade for their living and well-being. Turning from the east to the west, a potential source of revenue for the government was the sale of western lands under Congress's control. But it required tremendous resources to pay for an army to police those regions, to keep land-hungry speculators off of the land, and defend legitimate settlers against Indian attacks, resources that Congress simply did not have and did not have the means to raise. Perhaps most troubling was that foreign nations recognized how precarious the United States government was and began to make demands and negotiations aimed at playing one part of the Union off against the other. One set of failed negotiations with Spain over use of the Mississippi River literally threatened to split the nation in two. By 1787, it was abundantly clear to everyone who was willing to see it that the Articles of Confederation were in need of substantial revision or outright replacement, hence the calling of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in May. Technically speaking, the convention's authority was questionable at best, especially once it determined that there was no hope of turning the Articles of Confederation into an efficient government, and they were scrapped in favor of an entirely new constitution. But the nation's leading political thinkers were there, ready to tackle the difficult job of designing a new government to remedy the multitude of problems facing the nation and to balance the many complex and competing interests of the various states. Presiding over the convention was George Washington, who contributed little to the day-to-day debates and deliberations, but whose very presence added great legitimacy to the convention's proceedings and to the Constitution it produced. While he remained quiet in the convention hall, behind the scenes he was quite vocal in expressing the same concerns he had for the past decade. In May, he wrote to Thomas Jefferson, who was serving as a diplomat in Paris at the time, quote, that something is necessary, all will agree. For the situation of the general government, if it can be called a government, is shaken to its foundation and liable to be overset by every blast. In a word, it is at an end. And unless a remedy is soon applied, anarchy and confusion will inevitably ensue. By July, his view of the situation had changed very little, as he wrote to Alexander Hamilton that if one reviewed the progress of the convention to that point, it would reveal, quote, little ground on which the hope of a good establishment can be formed. In a word, I almost despair of seeing a favorable issue to the proceedings of the convention, and do therefore repent having had any agency in the business. He also complained of, quote, men who oppose a strong and energetic government as being narrow-minded politicians under the influence of local views. Now, while Washington was certainly prone to fits of pessimism, what had become crystal clear to him by the summer of 1787 was that the United States was an exceptionally weak nation, trying to prosper in a world of extraordinarily powerful empires. Most Americans, especially those under the influence of local views, didn't seem to recognize how truly weak their nation was, or how dangerous this weakness could be. They didn't seem to recognize that only a new constitution with a strong national government could stave off the anarchy and confusion he predicted. Washington was pleased then that the Constitution completed in Philadelphia on September 17, 1787, established a much stronger government than he had expected. It didn't go quite as far as he would have liked, but at least he could begin to hope that it had gone far enough. Even with a new and improved plan of government being sent to the states for their approval, though, Washington knew that the nation's survival would depend on the will of men and their ability to prioritize national over state interests. In the winter of 1787, 1788, while the Constitution was still being considered for ratification by the states, and while war between Great Britain and France appeared to be imminent, Washington declared to a confidant that in the event of a European war, quote, we shall feel more than ever the want of an efficient general government to regulate our commercial concerns, to give us a national respectability, and to connect the political views and interests of the several states under one head in such a manner as will effectually prevent them from forming separate, improper, or indeed any connection with the European powers which can involve them in their political disputes. We shall certainly get involved unless there is energy enough in government to restrain our people within proper bounds. While it soon became clear that peace would prevail in Europe, if only for the time being, it did not wholly ease Washington's concerns. In August 1788, he declared his, quote, hope that the United States of America will be able to keep disengaged from the labyrinth of European politics and wars, as he predicted that a period of peace, along with the adoption of a good national government, would allow the United States to, quote, become respectable in the eyes of the world, so that none of the maritime powers shall presume to treat them with insult or contempt. That's the end of all the long quotes. Washington was clearly viewing the Constitution through the lens of great national questions. But when it came to ratification, many state commentaries continued to focus on local concerns and fears over the ramifications of establishing a stronger national government, especially one that placed so much power in the hands of the newly created office of President of the United States. Two factors helped to ease the fears of many Americans, though. First was their total trust in Washington, that he would not sign his name or lend his reputation to a dangerous plan of government. If Washington had approved of it, why shouldn't they? Second, and much more important, was the expectation that Washington would be elected as the nation's first president. And if anyone could be trusted to faithfully execute the powers of that office without abusing them, certainly it was the father of his country. For all of these reasons, and a multitude more that we don't need to consider today, the Constitution was ratified and went into effect in early 1789. Now, to say that Washington faced a daunting task as he prepared to take the oath of office on April 30th, 1789, would be, to put it mildly, an understatement. His job as president was not just to oversee the establishment of the first government under the Constitution, as he also needed to shape a government that would be capable of withstanding the diverse challenges it would face both at home and abroad. he also needed to work to convince the states and the citizenry to pledge themselves to the new national project they were embarking on, to invest themselves in its success, and to permanently place national interests above local ones. In essence, he needed to transform the Constitution from a piece of paper laying out a form of government into a sacred text at the heart of an inviolable union of the states. All of this is to say nothing of the hopes and expectations and demands being placed upon him by the rest of the nation. But beyond these big picture concerns, Washington did still face the enormous task of actually setting up that new government. Certainly, he was not acting alone in this process, as it largely fell to Congress to create most of the government institutions built on top of the sparse framework laid out by the Constitution. But once they had engaged in their bevy of institution making, it was then up to Washington to fill the nearly 1,000 new offices that had been created. This meant sifting through literally tens of thousands of pages of letters written by eager office seekers and people vouching for their qualifications to find just the right person for each of those new positions. Eventually, tasks such as this would be delegated to the executive department secretaries or to the president's staff. But in these early years, there was no one to delegate to. While an arduous task, it was one that Washington took very seriously, as the new government would only seem legitimate if it executed its responsibilities efficiently and if the people in its employ were well qualified for the jobs they carried out. As a result, Washington refused to use patronage to fill these posts. He didn't distribute jobs to friends and long-lost relatives. He didn't give them to relatives of influential political leaders or to people he hoped to extract favors from later. Instead, with each position, whether it was Secretary of State, Supreme Court Justice, or Customs Collector for a port in New Hampshire, he strove to find the person best qualified for the job. The only other criteria he used in making such decisions was that he automatically disqualified anyone who was a known opponent of the Constitution from holding any offices underneath it. He did not want to appoint people who might potentially work to subvert the Constitution. Among the most important appointments Washington had to make were the heads of the departments that would assist him in carrying out the great duties of the executive branch. These men were Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. It was with these people that Washington would craft the nation's diplomatic approach to the rest of the world, would direct commercial policy and growth, and would navigate America's relationship with its diverse Indian populations. It was also this group of people that would most directly shape the new government's behavior. What powers would the department secretaries wield, and how would they relate to the president? What powers would Washington utilize in carrying out the duties of the president? And how would the executive branch interact with Congress? These were all questions on which the Constitution was at best ambiguous and at worst completely silent. And these were issues that mattered on a fundamental level. Washington was acutely aware that people paid attention to everything that he did, and that all of his decisions and actions would set precedents for the behavior of future presidents and the functioning of future administrations. He thus understood that in everything that he did, he was giving permanent form to the presidency. 3 examples should suffice to demonstrate how decisions that Washington made on issues such as these directly shaped the future operations of the government and the actual meanings of the Constitution. First, the president's relations with the cabinet. What role was the president to play in the conduct of executive business? Would he delegate authority and decision-making to his department heads and simply oversee them as something of a figurehead, somewhat similar to how he oversaw the Constitutional Convention? Or would all deliberation and decision-making flow through him? Given Washington's concerns for the effective operation of government, you can probably surmise that he chose the latter, allowing the secretaries to deal with the day-to-day minutiae of managing their departments, but reserving for himself the right to make all final decisions of any importance. This was especially the case when it came to the functioning of the Departments of State and War, where Washington was well-versed and of strong opinion. In the case of the State Department, because Washington had such a clear vision of how the United States should and should not relate to other nations, he was very careful to make sure that Thomas Jefferson was conducting the business of the department in line with his personal expectations. When it came to matters of the Treasury, where Washington was much less fluent in issues of finance, Alexander Hamilton was given a freer hand on most smaller issues. But on larger questions of national policy, Washington still demanded to be the one making the final decisions, even if it meant having to regularly sit through crash courses on the finer points of international finance. This made Washington, and the president more generally, the repository of power within the executive branch. In certain circumstances, it also turned him into the arbiter of disputes between his department heads, and this serves as my second example. The Constitution laid out a wide variety of responsibilities for the various branches of government to carry out, but in many cases remained largely silent as to what powers could be wielded to do so. In many ways, Washington's presidency was defined by the battle between Secretary of State Jefferson and Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton over the answer to that question, over the nature, scope, and powers of the federal government. Jefferson believed in limited government and in a strict construction of the Constitution, meaning that the powers that Congress and the President could exercise were only those that were explicitly granted in the document. Hamilton believed, on the other hand, in the need for a more expansive government with farther-reaching powers, and as a result, he argued for a loose construction of the Constitution and for the doctrine of implied powers, that if the Constitution expected Congress to carry out a certain responsibility, that Congress could then wield all reasonable power to carry it out, even if that power wasn't specifically granted by the Constitution. Now, to give you an example of what I'm talking about, really the first example that led to this tremendous disagreement in the first place was the creation of a national bank. Hamilton argued that a bank would be an essential tool in the regulation, protection, and growth of a national economy. Jefferson countered that because the Constitution did not give Congress to create a bank, Congress could not create a bank. Washington ultimately agreed with Hamilton on both the bank and the larger question, that if the new government was going to be capable of holding the states together and leading the nation forward in an increasingly hostile world, it was going to need to have a wider range of powers at its disposal. This was a decision meant to meet the needs of a weak nation, but it was also a decision that fundamentally shaped the future development of the country. My final example deals with the relationship between the executive branch and Congress. In many ways, this question is more complex than the other two because it wasn't just Washington deciding how he wanted to conduct his affairs, but instead it was Washington battling with Congress over how they would deal with each other. Congress, and the Senate in particular, believed that it should be the dominant branch of government, that the president should be dependent upon it in decision-making, and that it should fully share in the executive authority. The Senate, after all, represented the states in this new government, and the states were entitled to a greater say in the conduct of the nation's affairs. But such arguments ran counter to the basic premises of the new government, the new national government, and Washington strongly disagreed with any sharing of authority. He quickly determined that if the Senate represented the states and the House represented the people, then it was the president who represented the nation, and that he should stand apart from Congress and looking out for national interests. To modern observers, this seems like the logical arrangement of power. The president does his thing, Congress does their thing. But if Congress had gotten its way, its power and influence would have overwhelmed that of the president. We actually have insight into what the presidency could have looked like if Washington hadn't been so adamant, in the form of the first treaty presentation to the Senate, when he sought that body's constitutionally mandated advice and consent. Imagine the spectacle of President Washington and Secretary of War Henry Knox walking into the Senate chamber, sitting down before the gathered senators, handing the treaty with some regional Indians to the Vice President John Adams to be read to the Senate, and then waiting as senators debated the various components of the treaty right in front of him. Washington had come with a list of 7 specific questions that he wanted the Senate's advice on. And for each one, the austere body went round and round in debate before voting to postpone further consideration of the question to a future date. With each decision of indecision, Washington grew visibly more irritated and eventually blurted out in the middle of debate that what he was witnessing defeats every purpose of my coming here. Everyone was immediately embarrassed by what had transpired. Washington for having blurted out, the Senate for having annoyed so seriously the father of their country. But when Washington returned the following Monday for the Senate's reconsideration of each of his 7 questions, he witnessed much the same display all over again. When the treaty was finally approved, he vowed never to endure the process of seeking out the Senate's advice again. And instead, he determined that he would only send along his final decisions to the Senate for their consent. Once he approved a treaty, he would then send it to the Senate. Once he had chosen a nominee for a position, he would give that name to the Senate. If the Senate disagreed with his decisions, it could then give its advice in explaining the cause for disagreement. But it would not be a part of the deliberative process until that point. In this episode, we truly get to see Washington's approach to the Constitution. He began by trying to follow the letter of the document before realizing that it was an inefficient and demeaning practice. So instead, his approach was modified to live up to the spirit of the provision in a way that would protect the president's time, his central role in the process, and, much more importantly, the national interest. What should be clear from all of this is that Washington envisioned a government that featured a strong executive branch headed by a strong executive. This was not because he had any desire for personal power or respect, as he already had both in spades, but instead it was because he believed that the president was the only truly national figure established by the Constitution, and that it was this person, more than any other, who could work to ensure that the government addressed the wide variety of concerns that we've already discussed. Most importantly, it was that person who could best work to solidify and make permanent the union of the states under their new Constitution. Due in large part to Washington's influence and all of the work he had done to shape the presidency, by the end of his 8 years in office, virtually all fears of the government's power or stability had faded from view. As Washington argued in his farewell address, which he issued at the end of his presidency, the United States was still a weak nation. But if the country followed the example he had set, the day would not be far off when the country would truly attain national greatness. In the end, while much can be attributed to Washington, it is important to remember that everything that he did was built upon the framework of the Constitution. And thanks to his efforts, that document was cemented as the anchor of the union he so cherished. Thank you. I'm willing to take any questions anyone has. Yes?
You mentioned how Washington was very aware of how weak the U.S. was in relation to the European powers. I was wondering, does he ever give his ultimate vision for what the U.S. could be as someday rivaling or being more powerful than the European powers?
The question was Washington's clear understanding that the United States was so weak. Does he ever give a more specific expression of what he expects the country to become? One of the amazing things about Washington is that he is simultaneously able to predict the future without actually saying anything concrete. He never comes out and says that this is what the nation's going to look like in 15 years if we do X, Y, and Z. Instead, he says, if we are able to follow by the example I've set, his farewell address goes into great detail on this. If we're able to, not engage ourselves in European politics, if we're able to maintain ourselves, if we're able to grow our commerce without growing our diplomatic and political connections with the rest of the world, we have the ability to rise in greatness. We have the ability to rival them. In Washington's ultimate goal that he expresses multiple times isn't to rival them militarily, isn't to be able to send an army over to Europe and kick some butt. It's to be able to be strong enough militarily that the nation can do what it can, spread its commerce without having to worry about being violated. Meaning I can send my ships out to France to trade with France, and I don't have to worry about Great Britain intercepting my ships because Britain knows there's nothing I can do about it. So basically, his concern is respect. That the nation grow to a point where it will be truly respected on a basic level by the rest of the world. And he fully predicts that at various different points in time, he puts a time frame on it. At one point, he says within 20 years. At a different point, I think he says within 15 years. In his farewell address, he somewhat wisely doesn't put a specific time frame on it. But he says that in relatively short order, if we're able to develop as we have been. I mean, if you look at how the United States was in 1796 versus what the United States was in 1789, it's a completely transformed country in terms of the way it had developed and the means it had developed. It was still extraordinarily weak. But it was clearly on an upward trajectory. If that trajectory was able to continue, there's no reason that within a relatively short period of time it couldn't rival the great empires of Europe. Other questions? Okay.
Well, one would be a comment first. The comment would be, in your presentation, I guess maybe echoing David, Washington does sort of become a more pivotal figure in this than maybe the historiography acknowledges. But the other was that Washington clearly, given his background, is concerned with national issues, sovereignty. Some of the aspects and controversies over the Constitution and the focus on Madison and his Federalist Paper number 10 about we need a Constitution to prevent something like to make sure the have-nots don't rise up and take from the haves. Sort of the Constitution is a way to protect the interests of the wealthy against the poor in the United States. It sounds like that wasn't so. Washington was a guy. He owned slaves, but it sounds like his focus wasn't there exactly.
Well, I mean, the Washington being less focused on kind of the individual concerns of people and more concerned about the national concern, and part of that was because that's what he was concerned about the nation. The rich versus the poor, the debates over how people are going to live their daily lives in their individual homes, that was a concern for the towns. That was a concern for the states. Washington, for as much as he envisioned a strong federal government, wasn't looking to eliminate the states, wasn't looking to get away with the states. He completely recognized that there were many issues that the states should handle, such as dealing with inequalities between rich and poor and the interaction amongst people and things like that. His concern was structuring a nation that could survive as a nation, that could prosper as a nation, that could interact with other nations on an equal footing. On your first comment about Washington kind of not getting the credit he deserves for the formation of the government, I think that there's two reasons for this. One is that people give Washington so much credit for so many things in terms of the founding, in many cases much more credit than he actually deserves, that in the case of the Constitution, people somewhat rightly look towards Madison and look towards some of the other debates that took place. But I think the other important piece of this is twofold. One, when we're talking about the Constitution, James Madison was the one who took all of the notes from the Constitutional Convention. James Madison was the one who put forward the main plan that became the bulk of what the Constitution is. James Madison has the written evidence of this is what happened and this is why it happened, and it just so happens that I'm the one who's great in this scenario. Now, I'm not trying to say that he was intentionally skewing his writings or anything else, but there's this piece of paper that says Madison did it, and so historians can go back and say, oh, look, Madison did it. And Washington didn't have any similar writings. As the convention was going through, he wasn't writing things down. And he was intentionally not contributing on a day-to-day basis to the convention because he recognized that I'm not the intellectual that many of these people are. And more importantly, he realized that if he came out and said something, this is what the Constitution should look like, people in the room would listen to him, even if what he was saying wasn't the best plan. And so he let them fight it out amongst themselves. And then the other piece of it is that once he is president, once the Constitution is ratified and the government's established and he's in charge, so much of what he does is behind the scenes. Figuring out how the cabinet is going to work. There's no piece of paper anywhere saying that this is what should happen. It was up to him to kind of navigate that relationship and figure out what he wanted the cabinet to do and how he wanted it to function. The relationship between Congress and the president. Yes, the story I told about the Senate ratifying the treaty is that we have records of that. We have the story of that. But still, so much of that, he didn't keep a diary saying, oh, I went to the Senate today, and boy, are they annoying. I mean, it's all just kind of piecing it together from what we're able to glean from him. And so because he didn't leave behind these wonderful diaries about today I asked Hamilton to be my Secretary of the Treasury, and this is what I'm hoping we'll accomplish together. We don't have that kind of evidence, and so a lot of the day-to-day things that he's doing to kind of create the presidency are kind of forgotten to a certain extent. Yep.
Just on the same line, it puts the tradition of 2 terms in a new light now. Because before it was constitutionally dictated, it was just tradition. And I always thought it was because, there was this general fear that any more than 2 terms, people would be worried it was going to be a tyranny or something like that. But now I kind of see it as everyone kind of bowing to the precedent set by Washington, and it wasn't simply 2 terms, but that's symbolic of all these other things that he had put into motion, that not necessarily spelled out in the Constitution, but it is a manifestation and interpretation of the Constitution.
Yeah, the idea of the 2-term, the legacy, one of the legacies of Washington being the 2-term presidency. What's interesting about this is that after Washington didn't want to be president in the first place. He was an older gentleman at that time. He liked being on his farm. He liked being on his plantations, overseeing that. He served as president because people told him, if you say no, this whole thing's going to fall apart before it starts. After his first term, he said things were relatively peaceful. War in Europe hadn't really impacted the United States yet. Things were kind of going good in the country. And he started to talk to people and say, I think I'm going to be done after 1 term. I'm going to be done after 4 years. And he asked James Madison, who at that time was a close friend, why don't you write a farewell address for me? These are the ideas I want to express. Why don't you draft some things that we can talk about? And Madison did it, and it was a great farewell address. But finally people convinced him, yeah, things are okay right now, but if you walk away, it's going to fall apart. No one has the level of respect that you do. No one is going to, be able to control this thing and keep this thing together the way you do. And so he served the 2nd term, but by the end of his 2nd term, there was no way you were going to be able to convince him to stay again. And despite, as I talked about earlier, the fact that there was an increasing, criticism of Washington, which had never come about before. And one of the reasons he was ready to leave the presidency is because of that criticism. He didn't think he'd done anything wrong. As far as he was concerned, every decision he'd made was in the best interests of the country, and he didn't understand how people could not see that, and people could be criticizing him for that, because the country was quickly changing in a way that he wasn't prepared for in that sense. But so he was determined to leave after 2 terms. And what's interesting is that historians and people at the time have speculated that despite the fact that there was a growing criticism of him, he likely still would have been the unanimous selection had he stood for a 3rd term. But he died in 1799, before his 3rd term would have ended. And so we would have gotten this interesting and very problematic scenario where a president serves until he dies. Which obviously Washington wasn't looking at his watch in 1796 going, I'm going to die in 3 years, I probably shouldn't do this. But the fact that he stepped down after 2 terms is really important, given that had he just served until he died, what's to say that future presidents wouldn't have done the same thing? And obviously the transition from the vice president to the presidency, at a time when the government is still kind of getting its feet under itself, isn't going to be a smooth one. Especially when you think about it this way. In 1796, John Adams was elected president. John Adams was a Federalist. And Thomas Jefferson was elected as vice president. He was a Republican. Imagine if Adams had served until he died, which was 1826, which would have been a very long time. And Jefferson was his vice president. And granted, the scenario doesn't work anymore because they actually die on the same day. But a member of a different party taking over the presidency. Because the president no longer is really bound by a 4-year term, but is instead, once you're elected, as long as you're reelected, you can kind of serve until you die. Kind of like a monarch, and your replacement is elected rather than your heir. But there's all these scary ramifications for if Washington, the counterfactuals that historians hate, for what could have happened had Washington not stepped down after 2 terms. But it really is, for the longest time, a question of, it's what Washington did. I served my 2 terms. Granted, most of these people, by the time they've served 2 terms, they've been in office 8 years, they've been away from home for 8 years. With the exception of the presidents who are from Virginia, it's a long trip to get from Washington, D.C. back to Boston, in a carriage drawn by a couple of horses. You're away from home for months and months at a time. And in often cases, your family didn't come with you, depending on where you lived and what the situation was. And so after 8 years, they were ready to be done. It wasn't just respect for Washington. They were just ready to be done. Thomas Jefferson said, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to go home. But it really is in later years when transportation gets easier and the job isn't quite as so thoroughly soul demanding, it's still the respect for Washington that kind of keeps people in check and keeps people in line for the 2 years until Franklin Roosevelt runs for his third term. And dies during his fourth. But by that point, we'd had presidents die in office, so it was much less of a question of... Yep.
You mentioned how Washington didn't speak during the Constitution because he understood his stature and the respect he commanded. I was wondering, did that limit him in other decisions, and how did he maintain that balance? Was that a hard balance for him to maintain, or?
I mean, the question is Washington kind of maintaining a level of silence in the Constitutional Convention, and was that a hard balance to maintain and things like that? In the convention itself, it wasn't difficult for him to maintain his silence. Washington really, it's hard to tell now reading the sources if it's modesty or if it's false modesty or if it's real self-doubt. Washington didn't think of himself as being an intelligent person. When he came into the presidency, he talked repeatedly about how he wasn't up to the task. He feared that he wasn't going to be capable of doing everything that he understood that needed to be done. And again, it's hard to tell when he says these types of things, well, is he just being modest? Is he just saying these things because this is what an enlightened gentleman in this time period should say? Or does he actually harbor these kinds of self-doubts and fears? It's hard to tell what the exact line is. But in the convention, he doesn't have a problem just kind of keeping to himself, overseeing things, doing what needs to be done as the chair of the convention, but letting these much smarter people get into these much more heated and intellectual and high-level debates. I mean, if you go back and read, you can read most of the debates, and they get pretty intense in terms of, not in terms of, no, you're wrong, not that kind of intensity, but just in terms of the really difficult concepts they're grappling and what they truly represent. What does it mean to go from a one-house legislature under the Articles to, should we have two houses? How should those two houses be elected? You know, they seem like simple questions to us because we've operated under the Constitution for 200 and a little bit less than 223 years. But they're so complex, and the ramifications of each small thing are so significant that Washington doesn't have a problem saying, I'll just sit back and watch. I'll be concerned about what you're doing, and I'll be happy about what you're doing if it meets what I'm looking to do, what I think is important. But I don't have a better plan in mind. I don't have an idea that I'm coming here to express. I'm coming here because my presence is important, not because anything I'm going to say here would be important. And then once he's president, he doesn't have that same hesitancy to speak. Once he's president, at that point, it's not just the theoretical discussion of what should this look like. It's the practical discussion of what do we need to do to move forward. And at that point, he did have real ideas and he did have real concerns that he wasn't going to hold back on expressing. Yep.
You mentioned earlier about the fact that he recognized the states and the powers of the states. What documents are there that show that he recognized state powers?
If you go back and look at a lot of his letters that are written at the time of the Constitutional Convention, and if you go back and even just look at, there are different issues that will come to him during his presidency, where it's clear that he's, you know, this is an issue of states' rights, this is an issue of everything else. I mean, I think the clear example of this is slavery. Washington is a slave owner. He's, you know, historians like to paint him as being a very magnanimous slave owner, that when he dies, he sets some of his slaves free and then says that some of them have to stay and take care of his wife. When his wife dies, those will be free as well, and everything else. But Washington at no point in time as president ever really discusses slavery, because he recognizes that's a state issue. That's something that they're going to deal with. This isn't a national question. This isn't something that I need to be here to talk about. This is a state issue. And slavery especially is something that, with all of the founding fathers in this period, during the convention they recognized that we might want to be doing something about this. This could cause issues someday, but if we say anything about it, it's going to really annoy the Southerners, and they're just going to leave, and then it's all going to fall apart. You know, so they just kind of agree to not really get into it very much. But if you look at if you look through any of their papers, you'll see comments about how this really can't be a national question. This really has to be something that's left to the states to figure out. And so I would suggest starting with slavery rather than a specific time period and looking through papers like that. Yes?
So if that's Washington about slavery, how did he deal with, why was he willing to go in on the Whiskey Rebellion? Because that was also an issue of local state taxation.
Actually, no. The question was, why was he willing to go into the Whiskey Rebellion? The Whiskey Rebellion was a national excise tax that the government had passed because Hamilton believed that they needed to find other ways of generating revenues besides just imports and exports. And so there was a tax put by the nation on whiskey. And so they were rebelling not against a state tax, but against a federal tax, the federal government overreaching its powers, abusing them, and everything else. Yeah. I think our hour is up.
Our hour is up. So let's thank Jeff Melanson for this wonderful talk, and the audience for actively engaging with it.
Yes, thank you.
Today's talk was brought to you by the American Democracy Project and the Department of History. The event was recorded by CATV for future broadcast and will be available on MDON. Thank you so much for coming, and enjoy the pizza in the back if there's still some left.